history didn't begin with Columbus. Long before ships arrived from Europe, this land was already alive. Nations existed, trade routes thrived, families, languages, and cultures stretched across the Americas for thousands of years. That truth is no longer debated. What is debated? What is questioned? What is often dismissed without examination is the deeper story of who else was here, who arrived early, and who resisted together when invasion came. Because history isn't only written by evidence, it's written by power. When Europeans reached the Americas, they didn't arrive to empty land. They arrived to societies that already understood agriculture, astronomy, medicine, and governance. These were not primitive people. They were organized, intelligent, and deeply connected to the land. And when colonization began, something unexpected happened. Africans and indigenous people found each other. Not through textbooks, through survival. Enslaved Africans escaped plantations and ran into forests, swamps, and mountains. Indigenous nations gave them shelter. Sometimes they adopted them. Sometimes they intermarried. Sometimes they fought together. This is documented. Black Seminoles in Florida, maroon communities across the Americas, Afro-Indigenous families who spoke native languages, practiced native customs, and resisted European control side by side. This alliance terrified colonial powers because united people are harder to control than divided ones. If this is already challenging what you were taught, pause for a moment. Like this video, not because you agree with everything, but because these stories deserve to be examined, not buried. And if you want more history they never taught you, subscribe now. As the United States expanded, it didn't just conquer land, it redefined identity. New racial categories were created, categories that did not exist before colonization. People who had always been native were suddenly told they were black. People who were culturally indigenous were stripped of their identity through paperwork, census forms, government rolls, blood quantum laws. The Dawes rolls didn't just record names, they erased them. Families that had lived as native for generations were reclassified. Land was redistributed. Citizenship was denied. History was rewritten quietly, bureaucratically, and permanently. And this is where the modern myth was born. The myth that all black people came to America only one way. The myth that indigenous and African histories never overlapped. The myth that resistance was scattered instead of coordinated. But myths exist for a reason. They make systems easier to justify. If people believe black Americans arrived only as enslaved labor, then slavery becomes the beginning of the story, not the continuation of a war. If people believe indigenous people disappeared instead of being reclassified, then land theft feels less violent. If people believe identities are simple, then complexity becomes dangerous. But history is never simple. Africans didn't just arrive in chains. Some were already here. Some were born into resistance communities. Some never crossed the Atlantic at all. And indigenous people didn't vanish. They were renamed, redefined, and written out. This wasn't accidental. When people lose their history, they lose their claims to land, to sovereignty, to truth. What followed wasn't peace. It was control. Criminalization replaced warfare. Incarceration replaced enslavement. Economic systems replaced chains. The battlefield changed. The objective did not. To separate people from their identity. To isolate them from each other. To simplify history so power could remain unquestioned. That is why stories like this are rarely taught. Not because they are false, but because they are disruptive. They force uncomfortable questions. Questions about who belonged here. Questions about who resisted together. Questions about what was taken. Not just from bodies, but from memory. This isn't about rewriting history. It's about restoring it. Because history doesn't disappear when it's buried. It waits. And when it resurfaces, it challenges everything we thought we knew. The truth is heavier than the myth, but it is also stronger. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. If this video made you think, share it with someone who was never taught this either. Leave a comment with what surprised you most, and subscribe. Because what they erased, we restore.